Hello, everybody. My name is Seth Resler. We're going to be talking about community building for podcasting in this session here. We're going to talk a little bit about what a community is and how you can monetize it with your podcast. I come from radio broadcasting. That's where I come from originally. I have been a podcaster for about 13 years, but I've been a radio broadcaster for about 30. And there's a lot of similarities between the two. One of them is that with both of them, it's very easy to find yourself in a room talking into a microphone, either by yourself or just with a couple of other people, and to forget that there's an audience out there, that there are all these other people that are part of your show, even if they're not participating in it at the moment. And so that's why when I was a radio broadcaster, my favorite moments were actually when we would get out among that audience, among that community. One thing that we would do every year is we would go and we would broadcast backstage at these festivals, the Warped Tour, which is a big punk rock festival, or Ozfest, which is a big heavy metal festival. And I love that. They were long days. You were sitting backstage interviewing a dozen bands over the course of 12 hours. It was hot, it was dirty, it was sweaty, it was gross. But what was great about it is that you got to see the impact that you had on the lives of the people who were consuming the product that you were creating. That you got to see the impact it had not only on the bands, but then at the end of the day, you would go out and you would watch the show and you would see the impact that it would have on the fans, on the listeners. And I loved that because it really brought a sense of community to what we did. And it was so much more fun to me than just sitting in the studio and forgetting that there's an audience there. Now, coming from radio, we make most of our money on ads. And I know that podcasting likes to distance itself from radio. It's kind of like they're our parents. We like to think that, oh no, we're very different than they are, but there's actually some characteristics that we inherited. And one of those is that I think a lot of podcasters, when they think about how am I going to make money off my podcast, the first thing they think of is ads. Because frankly, that's how it's always been. That's how it was in the radio industry. Let's talk a little bit about that, because there are some differences between podcasting and what radio was like when I started in it 30 years ago. And that's an actual wood engraving of my first day on the job. But back then, in order to create content and distribute it to the masses, it was difficult. You needed big, expensive equipment, like a printing press, like a radio tower, like a television studio. And not only that, you needed a team of professionals who were specially trained to get that content out to the masses. It's not how it is anymore. Today, anybody with a smartphone and an internet connection can create content, whether it's audio, whether it's video, whether it's photos, whether it's text, and they can distribute it all around the world. And that has some pretty big impacts on those of us who make our income off of ads and our content creators. The limiting resource, the finite resource, is people's attention. Okay, we can keep making more and more and more content, but at the end of the day, people only have so much attention, and we are all competing for that attention. And there's much more content competing for that attention than there was, again, when I started 30 years ago, and it was very difficult to create content and get it out to the masses. So what's the upshot of that? We have too much content competing for a finite amount of attention. And it is getting harder and harder and harder and harder to cut through. You're seeing this in the media industry, where more and more companies are laying people off. We're seeing this. This is not just a problem for radio or for audio. This is a problem for Disney. This is a problem for Paramount. This is a problem for Warner Brothers Discovery. This is a problem for the Washington Post. 21,000 media jobs were lost last year, and we're on track to see a similarly bleak year this year. So what do we do about that? And how does this affect you? There are 6 million podcast titles in Spotify competing for attention with yours. And according to Libsyn, you've got to hit about 5,000 downloads per episode before advertisers even start to notice you. And only 6.5% of podcasts hit that. That does not mean 6.5% of podcasts have allowed people to quit their job and become full-time podcasters. That means 6.5% of podcasts have advertisers that are saying, yeah, we'll take a look. All right. So what do we do about that? Well, a lot of people will tell you that you need to make more better content. And this advice comes in many forms. And you're going to hear it a lot here this week at Podcast Movement. They'll tell you create more content, create better content, and they'll use words for it. They'll tell you, oh, you need storytelling in your content. You need to optimize your content. You need to do A/B tests for your content. You need to, make sure that you release your content on a regular basis. You need to have higher production value for your content. All of that is a way of saying you need to create more better content. And that's not bad advice. In a vacuum, that's a very good advice. You should create more content. You should create better content. Better content is better than worse content. The issue is you're getting that advice, and you're getting that advice, and you're getting that advice, and you're getting that advice. And what happens when everybody here gets that advice and everybody who's not here gets that advice? What do we have? We have an arms race. Everybody's creating more better content, and they're all still competing for that finite amount of attention. So while you absolutely should create more better content, that's not going to be enough to cut through. And that's before we even start to talk about the fact that the robots are going to be making content soon too, and we're going to have even more content when they do. So I started to ask, as somebody who has spent my entire career creating content, what comes after content? What's next? And I thought back to my days as a disc jockey and those days when we were doing those backstage broadcasts. And that's what made me realize it's community. Community is what's going to help you cut through. So let's talk a little bit about what community is. And I'm going to let you in on 3 secrets here so that you can start to use this and put it into practice with your own podcast. Secret number 1. You've heard people say the riches are in the niches. That's close. The riches are in building spaces for the niches. I'll tell you a story. One of my first podcasts was called Taste Trekkers. It was for foodies who love travel and travelers who love food. It was sort of in that Anthony Bourdain vein. And I would interview food tour operators, these folks who are always at the top of TripAdvisor, who offer 3-hour walking food tours of their neighborhood, and you stop at 6 places, you get a sample of each, and they tell you the history. And I would ask them about, we talk about, hey, I've never been to Memphis. What dishes do I need to try? What neighborhoods do I need to go to? So on and so forth. And this was 13 years ago. And I got about 500,000 downloads, which was not bad for the time, because a lot of people weren't listening to podcasts at the time. But I wasn't able to monetize it in the way that I wanted to. So what did I do? Well, being a content creator, I said, hey, I'm going to create more content. And I launched a website to go with it. Put together a team. We started publishing 30 blog posts a week that were in the same vein. Hey, if you're going to this place, here's where you should go eat. And it did well. Google started sending traffic to it, but I still wasn't generating the revenue that I wanted to do. So I pulled a page from my radio playbook and I said, well, then I'll launch an event. And I raised $15,000 on Kickstarter, and I launched the nation's first food tourism conference. And we launched this in Providence, Rhode Island. And my thinking was this. We had, people representing cuisines from not only all over the country, but all over the world. And there's a lot of people who eat in Rhode Island, and quite a few of them actually enjoy doing so. And so I was trying to sell $30 tickets to people who would come and want to try different types of foods. And I had great press, great earned media. I had the radio stations involved, the television stations involved, the food critic from the Providence Journal involved. And I struggled to sell tickets, with one exception. The food tour operators who had been guests on my podcasts not only paid for the $30 ticket, but flew across the country to come to this event. And I thought, well, that's weird. But the next year, I added something. We launched a second day. It was an industry day just for those food tour operators. And there are far more people who eat in the state of Rhode Island than there are people who work in food tourism all over the world. But I sold Industry Day out in no time, and I struggled to sell out the Public Day. And I tried to figure out why, and I talked to these food tour operators, and what I learned is that if you're a food tour operator, there's maybe one other food tour operator in your same city, and you can't talk to them because they're your competition. And so what I was doing was providing a place where these food tour operators could come together and talk to other people who do the same thing that they do. And they were so excited about it that they were willing to take days off work and fly across the country to be a part of that. I didn't realize it, but I was building a community. And that's what a community is. A community is a group of people with a shared mission. These were all people who worked in food tourism and were trying to grow the food tourism industry. And when you are setting out to build community, what you are setting out to do is to build a space. You are creating a space where these people with a shared mission can gather together. And I want to contrast this with what we're all used to because we are all content creators. We're used to this idea that we create content and we attract an audience and then we monetize that audience. And the thing about the audience is we can talk to them. They can maybe kind of sort of talk to us a little bit. They can email us or slide into our DMs, but not really. With a community, you are building a space. And you are attracting members to gather into that space. And with a community, not only can you talk to them and they can talk to you, but they can talk to each other. And that's really, really important. That's what makes it work. So that leads us to secret number 2, which is that building spaces is easier than it's ever been in the history of mankind. It used to be that if you wanted to create a space for people to come together with a shared mission, you had to build a building. So we've got offices, we've got churches, we've got schools, we've got ballparks. These are all spaces where people come together with a shared mission. And these are expensive things to build. And sometimes we do them temporarily. Like this right here is a space for podcasters to gather. Next week, it'll be a space for something else to happen. So there can be temporary physical spaces, but this is expensive to put on too. Let's come back to this slide because we have a new set of digital tools. The first 30 years of the internet was really about publishing tools becoming cheaper and easier and more accessible. You no longer needed a printing press, a radio tower, a television studio to get your content out to the masses because you had WordPress or YouTube or Instagram or TikTok. But now that we're seeing the rise of a new class of tools, digital tools that I will call space building tools. And that's things like Zoom and Slack and Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups and Discord and all those ways that you kept in touch with everybody when it was a pandemic and we couldn't go out and we couldn't talk to each other in physical spaces. And these are what we use to build a community. And that's going to lead us to secret number 3. People will pay you for access to your space. Let's talk about the types of people. First, there are the members who want to get into the space. You can charge them in any number of different ways. And the second is sponsors, people who want access to those members in the space. And there's a number of different ways to do this, but these are the 2 basic types of groups that you can charge for a community. Here's an example of this right here. You're sitting in one. This right here is a community. We are all podcasters looking to become better podcasters. We have a shared mission. And Dan and Jared and the folks at Podcast Movement had built this space for us to gather in. And they are charging money to you so that you can be here as attendees. And they're charging money to all of these sponsors here so that they can set up booths so that they have access to you. That's how a community works. That's how you can monetize a community. And to be honest, there's a couple thousand people here. It's not huge numbers. I mean, I used to DJ in a club on Saturday nights when I worked in radio, and we drew about the same number of people. We didn't make the kind of money the Podcast Movement makes because those people didn't have the kind of shared mission that could be monetized. And that's what you see here, is that you have all these companies that want to get to all of you who have this shared mission. So that's how you can monetize it. I'll give you another example. This example I just discovered yesterday. Jillian Teets is here. You have a podcast called Sober Powered, which is for people who are recovering alcoholics and trying to stay sober. And she did a great presentation yesterday right on that other stage where she talked about how a podcast enabled her to quit her day job and work full time. And she put up this slide showing what pays her bills. And I want to point out something that I noticed that I think is really important. That purple slice there that occupies about a third of the graph, that's the ads. That big teal slice, that's the community. She's built a community on Circle. She's built a space where people who have that shared mission of wanting to be sober can come together, and she's been able to monetize that. This is another example. Elsie Escobar from Libsyn and Ariel Nissenblatt, who's from Descript over there. They have both built communities. Elsie built She Podcasts. It was one of the people who helped get that up and off the ground. Ariel runs a number of communities, including the support community for Descript. They are also monetizing in different ways. So communities can take a lot of different forms. There's a lot of different ways that you can monetize a community. I can't get into all of them here, but if you want to go ahead and download a free guide, 50 ways to monetize a community, there it is. So those are the 3 secrets. Number 1, the riches are in building spaces for niches. Number 2, building spaces is easier than ever because we have brand new digital tools that allow us to do it, and people will pay to access those spaces. That's it. And I want to thank you all for being here, and please go out and build a community with your podcast audience.